doesn't love a resurrection story? Who doesn't love a redemption story? A reconciliation story? Who doesn't love a remembrance story or a relationship story? Who doesn't love a story of a restoration? I do. I hope you do too, church. Read again and again and again all of these wondrous stories, the stories that motivate and excite us. All begin. Read again and again and again. Something in our very nature loves again and again and again. See my little babies with their constantly dropping of toys and things on the floor, and I pick them back up again, and you know kids love to hear the same stories again and again and again. And we have our lives in the great cycle of seasons, all of it again and again and again. And it is just magical every time it happens. Birth and springtime and transformation, that kind of renewal transforms us. Again and again and again, because it is good news. When I was a chaplain intern, oh gosh, many more years than I want to think about, at least 10 years ago, at Montgomery Place, which is a senior residence, the chaplain interns put on a service of morning prayer for the residents. And one morning as we were gathered there, it's probably about the year 2000 or so, we were gathered there, and our chaplain supervisor came up to us, and he said that this morning was going to be particularly difficult for one of the residents, but he was going to let her tell us the story. And as it turns out, this particular resident was sitting there in the chapel. She looked absolutely crushed. And during sharing time for morning prayer, she spoke to us about the Lutheran church that she had been baptized in as a child, an old clapboard, white-painted Lutheran church in Pennsylvania. And she said that that church had burned down the night before, and her daughter had called her to give her the news. That church where she had been baptized and married, where her children had been baptized, where her children had been married, and where her grandchildren were going to Sunday school, that church was gone. And the only thing left of this old wooden clapboard church was the front wall with the big door. Everything else was gone. A few days later, she shows us a newspaper clipping that her daughter had sent. There it was. All this charred disaster. And those doors standing at the top of a flight of steps. Well, this was a trauma that she felt and shared with us many times throughout that internship of mine in the summer. She could not get over that so much of what she had given to in the ministry of that congregation, so much that that community had offered her, so much that that community, that the congregation meant to the whole town, was gone. And she told us, though, that that congregation was determined to rebuild. It was going to come back. And that church was not going to be just a restoration, but a renewal. That congregation was going to come back to serve Jesus in a new way, in a new season. Well, about a year later, we had a little reunion of us interns there at Montgomery Place. And I asked her, how did it go? How's that church? And she said, I've got to show you. And she went back up to her apartment and came back down, and she showed me the newspaper clipping of the church. And there it was. They had rebuilt it to look almost exactly as it had been before, with the great central tower. And there, she said, were the doors. They had kept the wooden doors, and they were ready to be open again for another season of service to Jesus Christ. That is a renewal story, a restoration and resurrection story I love to tell, and I love to hear them all the time. Stories like that transform us because they are good news. Now, in today's gospel reading, there is the story of a different kind of renewal and resurrection. Because you know, Easter doesn't happen without Good Friday first. And so, this story that Jesus shares, this prediction, as it were, from Luke's Gospel, that the temple of Jerusalem was going to be destroyed, very likely the Gospel text was written after the fact, but it was written in such a way to reveal that really, when the greatest tragedy and loss strikes, God is going to be at work. In 70 AD, if you know the history, Jerusalem's temple was laid flat, not one stone upon another, and because of the continual chronic rebellions and revolts and insurrections that Jews were staging in Judea at the time, the Roman army came in and made the city a bloodbath. Okay. So, that sense of loss, of destruction, of hopelessness struck every Jew to the core of his or her soul. The Sadducees, who were the elite class who ran the business of the temple and the economy of Jerusalem, were suddenly out of a job. The Pharisees, this amazing movement of Jews that sensed that God really didn't need to have a temple in which to dwell, but that he dwelled within the hearts of the devout Jewish community, that he resided in the law of Moses, passionately followed by Jews. They are the reason you have Judaism today. And Christians, those of Jewish ancestry and Gentile ancestry, saw in the destruction of that temple a different kind of story, because they saw also the wide-spreading fiery Spirit of God going all across the Roman Empire, reaching across boundaries, across social lines and class lines, beyond gender, beyond slavery or freedom, beyond poverty or wealth. All of those things did not matter because the gospel of Jesus was reaching out to people in such a way it was astonishing to behold. So those who were Christians, when they saw the destruction of Jerusalem and saw the activity of the Holy Spirit of God throughout the Roman Empire, they sensed that that was where the renewal stories and the redemption stories and the reconciliation stories were going to happen. They found that as their good news. And in the midst of finding that as good news, they still waited for the Christ who had died and who had risen to come again. That was the intensity of their gospel message, that Jesus was going to come again. Well, it is stewardship season again here with the Advent community, and if you are new today, you get to hear a bit about who we are and what we are like. And we are now called to ask God for everything again. We are called to ask God for generous hearts, for generous spirits, to make gifts not only of our treasure, but our time and our talent and our souls. That is the kind of gift we are inviting God to make of us in this community. That is the kind of stewardship God calls forth from us again and again and again. And you know, if it was just going to be a matter of let's fill out this card and call it a day, it would be a chore. It would be an almost impossible task, like rolling a giant boulder uphill only to see it fall back down. And there are times in every congregation's life when that is indeed the case. It feels like it's just an impossible task, thankless task. Gathering every week, in this congregation, feeding those who are homeless, caring for those who seem most lost, being a place of spiritual home. In a neighborhood that's very transitory. It can feel like that sometimes. You just start and roll back. Start and roll back. So every congregation, this one and every congregation, needs a sense of renewal and resurrection. This is a time to celebrate it very powerfully. I want to remind you, I look at this church and I think to myself, good Lord, most of these people weren't here 4.5 years ago when I came here. 4.5 years ago when I came here, this church was ready to close. 4.5 years ago, 5 years ago, this church was in profound conflict with a former clergy leader 4.5, 5 years ago, they couldn't afford to even have me come twice a month. And I think about how hopeless and despondent and hurting people were. This congregation wondered if it had a place in this neighborhood. I remember having one of those sort of conversational sermons, and I asked this congregation about 4 years ago, I said, what do you think this church is known for? And I remember someone, oh God, I hope it's not anyone who's remembering this right now, but I remember someone saying, I think we're known for the beauty of our stained glass windows. And I thought, oh boy, we've got a long way to go. We have a long way to go, God, and we've come a long way. We've come a long way to remember. We've come a long way in need of God's restoration. So many people here are new, gosh, within the last week, month, year, 2 or 3 years. And this place with its mission, very basic mission, to celebrate the Jesus story and to serve those most in need. We're no frills here, church. We are as basic, good news, gospel as we can be. But I think to myself, if we need a renewal story, a resurrection story, a restoration story, I think about the conversation I had with Pastor Eric Christensen, who is the pastor at St. Luke's Lutheran Church up the block there in Francisco. I had coffee with him a couple weeks ago. And I said, Eric, how long has it been since you've been at St. Luke's? And he said, you know, I'm going to be starting my 8th year there. And I thought, good God, that's longer than I thought. 8 years. He said, you know, it's funny. He said, I've been there, and I feel like I'm starting on my 3rd call, my 3rd congregation. He said, because the first 4 years that I was there, he said there were 12 members, and they were unhappy with the fact that their church was about to close. And they managed to get one last shot at some funding for him to come. And it took 4 years to sort of restart that congregation. And there's a certain kind of special touch you need for those 4 years. And he said then around that 4-year mark, he said, I felt like we had reached a very new level of being, a new kind of community. And he said, that was my 2nd call in the same church. And he said, and then we moved on to a very different way of organizing ourselves and shaping our ministry and our vision. And he said, now we're up to, about 100 folks in our membership rolls, about 75 people on a Sunday. He said, now it's my 3rd call in the same church. There's renewal all the time. I'm hoping that this year is going to be a year of renewal for us. We have done so much work in the past year at transforming significant aspects of our worship life, music ministry, shaping ourselves up with renovations of that kitchen so that we can serve hospitality better, especially to those who are in the warming center ministry of Newcom. It's here now. So much work and so much passion has been brought into this place. We need to build on that as a firm foundation, on that solid rock upon which we stand with Jesus. Who loves a resurrection story? I do. Who loves a renewal story? I hope you do. Who loves a restoration story? I hope we do. Because, church, we need to hear those stories again and again and again until Jesus comes back. Amen? Amen.